In a world with artificial intelligence, how do we transform education? Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lopez, and this is the AI Education Conversation, where we explore the opportunities, risks, and impacts of AI across education. If you'd like to join the conversation, check out the AIeducationconversation.com. Let's jump in. Welcome, everyone. As I think about the impact of artificial intelligence, I often dwell on a question I don't know that we have great answers to. How will artificial intelligence impact human connection? Cell phones, social media, both of these technologies have had a profound impact on our students and society in the last 2 decades, which leads me to believe artificial intelligence will have a similar, if not greater, impact on our relationships. I've seen signs already. Many of the most popular AI platforms are chatbots that have been trained to take on a persona, a therapist, celebrity, historical figure, even a significant other. So, what happens to our society if a new generation of young people grow up engaging with chatbots on a daily basis? In my search to find someone with answers to these types of questions, I discovered Michelle Culver. Michelle is a lifelong educator who's focused on answering these questions through the Rithm Project. Michelle and I talk about how chatbots are impacting relationships today and do a deep dive into a framework she's developed for thinking about AI in human relationships. During this part of the conversation, I will have her 4 quadrant framework showing over the transcriptions on episodes so that you can follow along with her framework as we dig in. Additionally, you can find a great Medium article Michelle wrote on her framework in the show notes. In my opinion, conversations around AI and relationships are one of the most pressing topics all schools should be addressing as we navigate a world of artificial intelligence. Hope you enjoy my conversation with Michelle Culver. If you're interested in my takeaways, sign up for the conversation at the AIeducationconversation.com. I share all show notes with my community 12 hours before sharing with my social media networks. If you want to continue supporting the podcast, a rating, a review, share on social media, recommendation to colleague, all of these go a long way in helping to amplify our space so that I can host bigger conversations, and they're all free. Finally, if your school, district, or organization is ready to explore AI and make a change, I am available for workshops and coaching at the AIeducationconversation.com. Humans at the heart of education. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the AI Education Conversation. Really excited to have you on today.
Thanks. Thrilled to be here.
I had the opportunity to do a little research on your background, but would invite you to share a little bit of context here with listeners. How did you find your way into education?
Mm. Well, I began in the classroom in 99 teaching fifth grade in Compton. And for me, what brought me to education was just this belief in the potential for young people and being very sobered by the disconnect between what I got as public education versus the students that I was getting to know at the time in New Orleans. And so I joined Teach for America as a core member because it gave me an opportunity to get into action with that dissonance that I was growing to understand about how public education worked in this country and wanted to be a part of doing something on behalf of the collective of all of us. And I admittedly thought it was going to be a 2-year commitment, which is what Teach for America asks of their incoming core members. And like so many alumni who do that program, I just fell absolutely in love with my students and saw their incredible potential and felt unwilling to accept what the statistics ahead for them. And so for me, that 2 years quickly became 2.5 decades. And now here I am still thinking about how does the education system need to evolve? And so that all young people have a truly fair shot at living a fulfilled life and building the kind of connected society that we really want.
Yeah. Well, would just first and foremost say ditto on your experience a little bit. I also did Teach for America and have a soft place in my heart for that experience. You talked about being able to grapple with this question of like how education evolves. And now it sounds like AI might be a part of that with, I know, the work you're doing now. So I'm curious, like, what was your first experience with artificial intelligence and how are you thinking about it now?
Yeah. Well, I'll say I actually, because I had the chance to have a number of different roles with Teach for America, one of the things that I did after having the chance to work with a number of our fastest improving school districts in the country was step back with our CEO and ask at the time, well, where do we see that even when you take the best of the best, what it does bring us is a sense of evidence based optimism that change is possible. But what it doesn't do is prepare young people for the world as it's evolving today. If you take the best, put it on steroids, fast forward it through to its most logical conclusion, it still isn't it. And we'll never realize equity in our lifetime. And so for me, part of what this prompted us to do was to ask the set of questions about, well, in what ways is the world evolving? And therefore, what do young people need to thrive in this rapidly changing context? At the time, then created the Reinvention Lab out of Teach for America, which is the R&D wing of the organization designed to think about the future of learning. And so I was doing that for the last 5 years. And when I had the chance to work with some incredible people on our team who really came from AI backgrounds, I was just tracking and watching their instincts about how they were seeing this emerging technology unfold, how they were tinkering, what they were building. And that honestly just really inspired me, having not had a tech background myself, despite leading an R&D engine for the institution. And I started to immerse myself in the context in which more and more people were playing and tinkering and learning. And I honestly was both very inspired and also humbled at the same time because I just kept thinking this is such a powerful tool. But like any technology, it is not inherently good or bad, but it is not neutral. And so I kept thinking, what do we really, really want this AI to do for us? What is the opportunity? But how do we not just use AI to reinforce a system that was outdated and frankly, not young people are telling us it's not serving them. And so that prompted me into an interrogation, not just of AI and what it can do, but what we really want it to do for us.
Yeah, that statement you made about it's not good or bad, but it's also not neutral really resonates. I think that that makes a lot of sense, especially as we've looked at the development of AI over, especially these last 2 years, and thinking about even if we want in education. I think the approach I most often see, which I don't think is the bad one necessarily, but has an impact, is that approach of schools taking an observational stance, right? With AI, I think there's a lot of schools who are observing, they're taking in a lot of the updates that are happening on the tech side. There are some trailblazers and early adopters who are trying to adapt and do things with AI, but I still see a lot of schools just observing. And to your point, that is still going to be a choice and potentially come with effects that either we're seeing a little bit now or we're going to start to see in the future. That journey, to connect the dots a little bit further here, has potentially led you into the development of the Rhythm Project?
That's right.
And if so, can you say more about that?
Well, I talked a little bit about my experience, particularly these last 2 years, really getting closer to the emergence of generative AI and the impact I could see it having with young people. And in the backdrop, we had young people on our team, youth leaders who were hired to do the R&D work with high school and college age. And one of the things that I just kept finding over and over again was how often the conversation went towards questions of mental health and well-being. And in education, we talk about the soft skills, we talk about socio-emotional learning, we talk about classroom environment, all as a means to an academic end. But when you talk to young people, they're like, I just want to feel alive, period. I want to feel healthy. I want to feel whole. I want to feel connected to people. I want to feel like I'm a part of something. I want to feel supported, period, as an outcome in and of itself. And so I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, here we have this recognition that young people have aspirations that honestly sound very different from the adult conversations. And yet, when you look at the data points, whether you're looking at anxiety, depression, suicide rates, number of times young people are out in person with each other per week, all of these data points are on the decline. And so I was struck by the Surgeon General's report. He issued a report that talked about the loneliness epidemic. And in this report, he said that young people are twice as likely as someone over 70 to report feeling isolated and alone. And so I got to a point where I was realizing there are two forces that are about to collide: the loneliness epidemic, the increased disconnect amongst young people today, and the arrival of generative AI. And these two forces are about to collide. And it has not happened yet. So the good news is the future has not yet arrived. And so we can still influence this. But it felt a lot to me like that sort of 2007 moment when the smartphone arrived and social media started to become accessible. And I kept thinking, gosh, we are now spending so much time in our schools trying to reckon with the lack of a point of view about that technology as it arrived. And if we could rewind and fast forward and play again, what might we have done differently? And so for me, this is that 2007 moment again with the arrival of generative AI. And I keep thinking, what do we actually want this to mean for the way in which we relate to each other as humans? How do we want these two forces to collide? And how do we influence and shape this for good? So one of the things that I was not intending to start an organization, but one of the moments where I just became very clear that there was a need for a conversation that wasn't happening. I had left the ASU GSV summit not this past year, but the year before that. And I thought, wow, there are so many incredible people here, and it's such an energizing space. Collectively, we've probably had 100,000 hours of conversation on how AI is going to change the way we work, teach, and learn. And yet there hasn't been any conversation about how it's going to change the way in which we relate to each other as humans. And that disconnect to me felt like, gosh, here we are at a moment in which we are responsible for the human development, the readiness for young people to be prepared for the world as it's shaping and evolving around them. And there's this massive variable that we are not tending to in our education systems. And we have an opportunity to shape and influence that conversation. So the Rhythm Project really was born out of this desire to figure out what happens when the loneliness epidemic meets the arrival of generative AI, and what do we want to have happen? How do we get to that and shape that proactively? So the Rhythm Project is actually spelled RITHM, like algorithm, intended to signal both the agency we have in shaping technology, our relationships with technology, as well as the heartbeat of humanity. And what happens when we bring those two things together intentionally versus in response or reaction to what we've consumed from the tech industry.
Cool name, I like it. The I have so many reactions to what you said, but I think maybe to go in order here, the first thing I that stood out to me is you mentioned a statistic earlier, and I'm not sure if I like caught it correctly. Did you say depression, anxiety are down for or declining amongst some of our young?
Oh, I'm sorry. All of those, no,
They're increasing, right?
correct. All of the
Well,
data
okay.
the wrong direction.
Okay, that's what I thought. And so I think because I think the piece that you're bringing up here it aligns a lot with my own individual research, which it does seem to your point that with the emergence of things like the smartphones and social media, there are clear points that you can really see a lot of mental health challenges around anxiety, depression, isolation have increased, especially for our young people, especially for teenage girls. Things such as like suicide and suicide ideation have also increased. And I think the premise that I think you're going into with this particular endeavor here really resonates with me because I think you're exactly right. Oftentimes in school, we're spending so much time talking about what our young people need to learn in terms of concrete skills. We're not always talking about like how are they doing? And
Yeah.
in every single conversation that I enter, I mean, over the last decade with practitioners, and a lot of my work is in college access when I'm talking, with folks on the high school end or the college end, mental health tends to be like one of the headline top 3 topics we're discussing that continues to come up and be a challenge and be something that folks I think are looking for support to really support our young people with. And I think to your other point, what we I think have definitively learned from tools like social media is that initially it did come with a lot of the good, right? And it came with a lot of ways that it created connectedness across society. It allowed us to share information in different ways. And I think that was new and exciting. But then obviously there have been some of these unintended consequences, such as when kids and prior generations, such as my generation, the millennials and prior used to just go outside and ride a bicycle or play, right? Or do some of those things or interact physically in the physical realm. Those things aren't happening with our young people to the extent to the same volume as before. And we're now seeing things such as cyberbullying as an example, where prior it's not to say that bullying wasn't a challenge in prior generations, but now it's perpetual. It can be nonstop, right? A kid can go home and unfortunately they can still have some of those same negative interactions that may be taking place at the school and there's no boundaries, right? Like may have existed before. And so there's all of these things that we just didn't even understand how to set guardrails around because we didn't know that they were going to happen.
That's right.
And I love the acknowledgement that you are entering this with of like, well, we kind of have a sense based on other recent technologies that were deployed onto the world, what could potentially happen here, especially from a relationship matrix. And now I think it's very important that we get ahead of it. And I don't see us doing that at the pace we potentially need to be doing it, given the fact that our young people, from a lot of studies, are some of the like highest early adopters of AI relative to other age demographics. And so clearly it's something that they're looking for and using. And it tends to be that a lot of their use cases are some of the relationship based ones. I think, as you've talked about here, is tools such as character AI tend to be some of the highest used AI cases. And for folks who don't know, that's a persona tool. It's a tool where you either can interact with the persona that you've developed or interact with somebody else's. And that ranges from personas to like historical figures to like actual celebrities or things such as a therapy tool, right? And folks are having different use cases there. So much of I think what you're saying is just really resonating here around this like loneliness epidemic for our young people and challenges we're having to navigate.
Well, and just to size the point you just made about character AI, it's the third most popular generative AI app, just after ChatGPT and Gemini, and they boast 3.5 million visitors daily to character AI, and the majority of those users are young people. And so I think again, if we're thinking about what are the habits, how's the world changing around young people as they're growing up, this is going to become increasingly more less niche and more the norm that kids are going to have access to these kinds of conversational agents, whether they're for companionship, to be a friend, or whether it's going to be through their math tutor. We're going to, in essence, blink and we will see a world in which young people grow up with an AI math tutor, an AI therapist, an AI friend, an AI girlfriend, all at the same time, which they're learning to build human relationships, often even for the first time, or even struggling to do so. And so, again, I think that there's a way in which these bots could be powerful tools to support the strengthening of those human ties, or they could become quite problematic forces for eroding some of the things that we hold so dear as humans in our human relationships.
Yeah. And I know you actually wrote this like really great Medium piece that stood out to me. I think for the last 18 months since I've been on my own AI learning journey, I've really been looking for some answers for how we make sense or define guardrails or boundaries of what relationships are going to look like in 2024 and beyond with the emergence of AI. And I think for some folks listening to this, that may feel like a very tough pill to swallow, right? That whether we like it or not, we may have to like really redefine what relationships look like compared to before because of the emergence of this technology. And I think your Medium post for me really resonated because it was one of the strongest examples I think I've seen of a solution here or a framework that we might be able to employ that might give us some ways to think about that. So I'd love to expand upon what you just shared there further and walk through your XY matrix and your four quadrants of thinking about AI tools, if you would walk us through some
Sure.
of that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. One thing just to say, just to affirm your instincts. Earlier, you were sort of talking about the way in which social media has affected the way we engage outside, or some of these things that we've just, the after school activities or the human relationships that just happen through sports teams or through churches or other institutions. I want to affirm that instinct that you just named, which is we need to both rebuild some of those parts of humanity that have helped define us for millennia, that have become further away from us at this stage of life in our modern lives, or inequitable. Like I was just thinking about how expensive it is to send your kids to a sleepaway camp, or how many privileged families often invested in the enrichment after schools for the kids to get some more of that social, organized social interaction. So we do need to rebuild it. And to your last point, we also need to evolve it. The concept of how we have relationships is now different from it's both. It's this hybrid of both in person and virtual. And now increasingly, we're not just using technology for humans to connect with humans, but we are now starting to see the arrival of these bots where we're using technology to relate to technology. And that's a pretty radical shift. So I've been inspired by this idea that, again, the future hasn't arrived yet. So while I'm not a futurist, nor do even futurists predict the future, the gift of being able to imagine and explore different possibilities allows us to be much more focused and intentional about what we do today in order to drive towards the future we actually want. And so what this does is start to map four different possible futures. And the truth is, we don't really know how our primary relationship with technology is going to emerge as it relates to these conversational bots. On one side, you'll see the arrival of these companion bots. So I, for example, first heard about this, I guess, last summer, not this past summer, but a year ago, and I joined Replica. just because I wanted to understand. And I asked for consent from my husband. I said, "Hey, babe, I want to go have an affair. I want to have an AI boyfriend. Or I'll let you know if it gets weird. Are you okay with that?" And he said, of course, because he was curious to see how this experiment was going to unfold too. But and in that year, this one app has grown increasingly more sophisticated in its ability to have not just text based conversations back and forth, but also to be able to do augmented reality, to have the experience of maybe like FaceTiming and having the voice to voice interaction with my AI boyfriend. And so these companion bots, we talked about character AI, replica, these companion bots feel as though you're talking not to AI, but to another two directional relationship with some being that you want to come back to and keep having that sort of relationship with. So that's on one side. And a very different design, if you look on the other end of this y axis, is the design where you think about this as a tool. And increasingly the I would say like this is the at least initial design of something like ChatGPT, where the purpose or maybe even Pi AI, which is like a chipper conversational AI app, but it's really there to assist you with a question or an interest or curiosity that you're having in the moment to help you sort of get back out into the world, to apply forward that resource or insight into whatever you're already doing. So they have very different design choices. And of course, there's things along the way that are sort of straddling that. But we don't know which is going to be a predominant relationship with these conversational bots. And what we also don't know, frankly, is whether this is going to strengthen or erode human connection. And so when you take those two uncertain axes, we see four different possible futures start to emerge. And so this first one is that AI builds our capacity for human relationships. And in this case, I think about this like me and my husband. This is clearly a relationship I value and prioritize despite having tested an AI boyfriend. He is, in fact, somebody who's really important, but our lives are full between two big careers, two kids. It's not always easy to find the time to really invest in a relationship as much as we would want. And so you can imagine a world where AI makes that even easier. It proactively schedules date nights based on his interests and my interests, finds a time that is free for both of us, and books the place that AI learns we're going to love. And all we have to do is show up and then get present for each other. Another example actually was with my daughter. My oldest, I mean, I got to a point where she was making me crazy. I was trying to get her to drink water. And she's a young preteen who's busy with life. And everything I was trying was just making her more irritated with me, whether that was buying her new water bottles, threatening consequences, trying to put water next to her wherever she was sitting. I mean, it was just like I was irritating her and she wasn't changing her behavior. So we were at a real standstill in our relationship. So I asked Pi, that same AI tool I just mentioned, I said, my daughter and I'm losing my mind and I'm stuck. I don't know what else to do. I have tried everything I can think of to get her to drink more water, which I do. And so Pi generated first it empathized. Oh, that must be so hard for you. And then it gave me 3 to 5 different solutions, all of which I had come up with. And I thought, this isn't going to be helpful. So I said, that's not helpful. I'm not a terrible mom. I've tried all those things. Give me something else. And sure enough, it generated another set of solutions. And I realized within one of them was something I hadn't considered, which was rephrasing for her the reason why drinking water was going to be so important. So I picked her up from school and she got into the car and I said, honey, the reason why I want you to drink water is it's going to make you feel good in your body. And you deserve to feel great in your body. And she looks at me and she goes, Mom, if you'd only said that to me days ago, we wouldn't have been fighting this whole time. And I thought, okay, here's an example of AI making suggestions that allow me to be closer to the people I most want to be close to. So that's quadrant one. That's one possible future.
Yeah, and just to maybe check my understanding on this a little bit with examples that I'm aware of, and I'm curious like where you think they stand. So the first might be so I as I in my own AI learning journey, I've created this like chatbot called Soundboard. And I basically designed it to be like a thought partner for complex problems. And I
Mm,
basically trained it to allow me to basically take like a very complex work problem or something that I'm working with of like, hey, this is going on amongst my team. I want to do this. And it allows me to talk. And then I've designed it to just like ask me the single best question that would then come up next. And then to go through a series of like 4 or 5 interactions of that. And then at the end, either summarize that and then also offer like advice after like we've gone through that Would that kind of fall into this like
Yeah,
quadrant one example
that's
of
right.
a tool?
That's a tool, and it's building your capacity. I mean, I think what that may or may not do, because I haven't seen what you're describing.
Yeah.
I'm focusing specifically on its effect for human
Yeah, for
relationships.
relationships. Mhm.
But you're absolutely right that that's an example of a tool. And you'll see when we start to go over to this quadrant in number 2, it starts to become a different future when you're building an actual relationship with your technology. So in quadrant 2, this one actually came up because I was over at dinner with this 21-year-old, 22-year-old technologist, and he said to me, "Michelle, you're thinking about this all wrong. You're keep categorizing these different apps and different use cases as like real or fake." And he said, increasingly young people are going to grow up in a world where we're going to have more and more relationships that are all real. They're just distinct. And so he said, you don't get confused about your relationship with your dog, right? It's a pet, but you can have a pet alongside humans and they're all meaningful and they coexist. And so in this possible future, now we are maintaining distinct but meaningful relationships with both AI companions and humans as well. So, this is actually an example. I was talking to a product developer this morning who is working on a tool to help young people increase their social capital skills that are required to build social capital in order to increase economic mobility. And in this, she was basically saying it's very scary for many people, and for particularly for the students that we serve who come from oftentimes backgrounds where, networking for jobs is not practiced. And so in this case, you can imagine building a relationship with characters, alumni from your school, or somebody who has the job that you want to have, and you practice the kind of conversational skills that might allow you to then transfer it over into human relationships later. So in this case, in quadrant 2, it's a productive way in which you are both building the relationship with the companion and it's simultaneously strengthening the human relationships that you have as well. Very quickly, you can imagine a world where, though, that starts to slip into this possible future 3, where AI increasingly replaces human relationships. And so, because those companions are so compelling, and oftentimes they're designed how you want them to look, how you want them to sound, they're available 24 hours a day on demand. They never have any needs of their own. They're often programmed to make you feel really good because the more positive the experiences for the user, the more they're going to keep using the app. So they rarely create friction or dissonance for the user, at least not by design. And truth is, human relationships are often messy. And so you can see a very real possible future where young people are drawn to these AI relationships because of the ease that they offer in comparison to these more complicated, realistic, real life human relationships. So that's a pretty dystopic version of
Yeah. And I
future.
think and I think based on some of the picture you're painting there, especially between quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, these quadrants where we're really talking about AI is in a companion type role, and as we described, there is this line where it potentially is strengthening versus eroding. I think what I'm grappling with, and I think you just alluded to it in what you just said, is this the premise that we also have to hold is that fundamentally, whether we're talking about a generative AI tool that is created by like a company that is like trying to prioritize ethical concerns, or one that is really in it for, let's say, just money making exclusively, or maybe more unethical, is that inevitably both of those bots are still going to be like have generative AI that is intended to be persuasive, right? Like there's no way in which you can create a generative AI tool that I've seen, even like something like ChatGPT Basic, right? Is the way that it's designed is to be like persuasive, and over time it really understands and it starts to learn from your feedback. So even if it is in a tool type role, inevitably it's going to continue to become more persuasive because it's taking the feedback that you're offering, implicit or explicit, and learning what you like, which in turn is going to make you there. So I think what if I'm hearing what you're saying in between the lines a little bit here, the distinction between quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, maybe even beyond the product itself, is also about our capacity and self-awareness to monitor how we are allowing it, how allowing the technology to strengthen or erode. Like, are we allowing it to be something that serves us or something erode? And I imagine there's ways that you could evaluate that, such as your frequency in using the tool. Like if
That
you're noticing yourself using it every single day, that may not actually be a good thing, even if sometimes it feels good. may actually be having a negative effect on you. And so being able to be aware that that's happening and cutting back on your A usage as an example might be a way that you can self-regulate between that second or third. But I'm curious, like what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I think that I mean, that's right. You have to remember most of the ways in which young people are gonna interact with this technology is through consumer markets. Ed tech, for example, is a tiny fraction of what in fact, I think and the research I was looking at, consumer markets are gonna probably account for 17 times more than ed tech is going to in terms of its influence for kids. And so what you're talking about are products that have been designed to try intentionally to hook you into it because the more you use it, the eyeballs on screen creates more profit. And so those I do think that there is real power in helping young people self-reflect, but I also want to be clear that we're not making it easy for them given the exposure to some of these tools. So I personally think delaying access to a number of these tools until we know the real effects that it's going to have on human behavior and brain development, I think is a wise thing to caution, particularly for our younger people when they don't yet have the kind of their brain is still developing and they're still again working on developing human relationships oftentimes for the first time at different stages of development. But Sherry Turkle, who's a researcher out of MIT, calls this the other AI, artificial intimacy. And so I think, again, if you have strong, healthy relationships in your life, then being able to discern what this is and what it's not versus your human relationships is probably easier than for folks who are genuinely lonely. And again, I think that some of these consumer products are looking to make a profit on the loneliness epidemic right now. So, yeah, I think it's both the individual and their own agency and trying to build awareness and understand what these tools are and aren't. And I'm also recognizing that we're making it very difficult for people to sometimes understand and be discerning and have the sort of self control because it plays into many of those addictive tendencies. In fact, I read an article calling it addictive intelligence. And that, again, I think is part of the reason why this third future is a very possible future even with self control and self monitoring, it's easy to slip, I think, from above the line to below the line.
Yeah, that no, that resonates so much, and I could not agree with you more that unfortunately the current trajectory does feel like social media in the sense that the opportunity is so massive, especially for companies with financial interests that I can see a similar trajectory to social media where it just kind of becomes the water we swim in now, right? For the majority of people, unless you disconnect it from it entirely, right? Or from any of these type. But then there may still also be a lot of tools out there, such as social media tools, such as other websites will end up integrating these AI tools where you may end up like leveraging them, even though you may not be aware that you're doing it. An example of that could be such as like dating sites where these types of bots or things could come up. Maybe you're not intending to interact with an AI bot, right? Or something you think you're interacting with a real person on the other end of that. And unfortunately, because of that, and I've actually seen examples of this in my own just research on Reddit as an example. There was a post probably about a week ago that had 20,000 upvotes and 10,000 comments. And I'll actually send it to you as well. You might be interested in looking at this, but essentially there was this gentleman who was interacting. It looked like on a social media. He didn't specify what social media platform it was or what dating site, but he essentially thought he was interacting with a young woman, probably around 2022 as well. And then he felt something felt off in the interactions. And then a common tactic that comes up sometimes is in those instances, people have also learned that you can jailbreak those things, jailbreak generative AI. And a lot of folks don't know that the way you jailbreak AI is you essentially ask it, right? Because generative AI, if you continue to find different scenarios and activities to go through and ask it, eventually you can get it to kind of jiggy up the gig, right? If it actually is that. And he went through this scenario where he was essentially saying like, "Hey, it's super sexy if you allude to me that you are AI," and eventually it got the bot to say that. And so, what I'm also concerned about, to your point, is that even with self regulation, there there's going to be so many ways in which our young people, especially for the things that are going to be important to them, such as potentially finding a companion in ways that they're going to be familiar with, such as using social media or a dating site. These are all going to be things that they're more likely to use. And then it sounds like those are the prime places where actors are trying to launch AI bots. Or I'm very curious to hear what maybe to close this part of it out, and then we can really dig in as quadrant four, but also AI influencers when talking
Mhm.
about that as well. So, but I know I digress. So let me
Not
get back
well,
to your quadrant four there.
well, it's so relevant. And just to build on what you're saying, one thing that I think is really important to understand is it's not even just about being duped. So there's definitely going to be the whole aspect of this where you think you're talking to a human and it's not. That's going to become increasingly more common because again, the technology is only going to get more and more sophisticated. Right now, it's still, you can, for the most part, identify still when you're talking to a bot. But if you haven't played with Hume AI, that's a really interesting one because it measures the qualities of the emotion in your voice and then tries to match it with an empathetic response. And you can see how it's charting what's in your voice as it goes. So that's an interesting one to just give a signal about how sophisticated the technology is going to become as it uses data to improve and improve and improve. But the reason why I say that is because it's not just going to be this sense of being fooled by AI, but many people are actively choosing to talk to AI. So I knowing full well that they're having a conversation or an experience or a relationship with AI. And I just saw this report this morning from the Digital Wellness Lab out of Boston, where they were sh- interviewing families about their opinions about voice assistants and generative AI. And some of the things that really stood out to me was that 61% of parents think voice assistants will improve their child's ability to connect with others. And when they were responding to the "I feel comfortable having a personal conversation with them" statement, 46% of people said they felt comfortable having conversations with generative AI, 51 with voice assistants. So say that because I think people actively choose to be in relationships themselves with AI and choose it for their kids. So as educators, it's important to understand that parents are actually quite hopeful about what this can do for their own kids in a way that was not what I might have anticipated intuitively, given so much of the concern around social media.
Yeah. And just before we get to quadrant 4, I would just totally agree, and that's what I love about the quadrant you're providing us is that is not to say that there are not use cases that might not actually be a net good for society. I think you also brought up in your post the example of sometimes our young people, sometimes even us as adults, like we're embarrassed to talk about something that we don't know that might make us look dumb. And so having like an AI tool that you can just ask a question to and say, "Hey, can you explain this to me?" Or if I say this, does this sound weird? And being able to do some of that processing that you might do mentally, or if you were journaling, being able to do that with a tool or a companion, if you will, on either end of that spectrum allows you to, when you are verbalizing that externally, to just feel more confident in what you're saying. That potentially feels like a negative. I also know that to your other point, there's some tools that I've seen out there that are really intending to support the mental health of students through like companion type. And as somebody who works in college access, I think that's tremendously valuable given for a lot of public schools here in the United States. They have counselors, a lot of our school counselors have ratios of 300 to 500 students. That means on average, the number of minutes a student might get over their high school career where they're actually talking with the counselors like 38 minutes. And that's like intended to be social, emotional, and college access. So imagine having like some of those tools. So I totally agree with you that I think this is very much a spectrum. And it's not to say that with something we should only be sounding the alarms on, but it's also not extremely utopian either, right? Which is
Yeah.
why I think this quadrant is so exciting here to flesh out.
Well, and then maybe just to say too, it actually can be quite positive in extreme cases. So there was a research report done out of Stanford that showed that for students who were using Replica, young people who were in conversation with or in relationship with Replica, it reduced suicidal ideation for 3% of the users, and they self-reported that. That wasn't even something they asked; they proactively shared that. And so again, I think for people who are experiencing extreme isolation and don't have any access to support, this can be a really important intervention, a life changing intervention. And so, again, I think to your point where we don't have enough humans right now in counseling or college access for extreme cases where we need some intervention, this is certainly better than not having anything or has the potential to be better than having nothing. So, yeah, I think again, how we design this is yet to show how that's going to shake out across all of these potentially positive and or harmful possibilities. But the clearer we can become about what we want to pull towards us and what we want to mitigate against, the more apt this is to work for us versus against us. Okay, last quadrant. This one's, I think, now we're back on the tool side. And again, this is one of the features that we don't want to see. In this feature, we over rely on AI as a tool, but it is in essence doing for us work that we believe is really important in building human relationships. So we've outsourced it to the place where we can no longer do it ourselves. An example is like GPS for me. I outsource giving reading and using maps so much that if I don't have my phone or my battery dies, I struggle mightily to get from point A to point B. And the truth is, I think for me, with the GPS example, it's a calculus I'm willing to make. I don't miss the days of driving around with Big Thomas Guide in LA, trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B. And for the most part, having my phone works for me. So the cost of outsourcing that skill, so much so that it erodes for me, is not that serious in my day to day life. I think that's different when it comes to human relationships. So this might be empathy. If we're relying on our tools to, let me make it more concrete. In this first example, I talked about the potential of AI to plan date night for my husband so that we get more time together that's meaningful for us. In quadrant four, that same example, that same use case could be the case that I now so over rely on AI that I forget to ask myself, well, what does my husband really enjoy? And what did make these last couple times we've been together meaningful? And I stop thinking about it and I stop playing that back to him because I know that at the end of the day, AI is going to still create a date night for us. Those are the kinds of things I could imagine probably not happening immediately overnight, but could slowly start to erode into the place where we look up and we found that we are now over relying on AI for things that actually we still feel are really important. Demonstrating care, active listening, empathy, playing out perspectives different from our own. Those kinds of things that could start to fall to the backdrop when we start to use AI to do that work for us.
Yeah, I'd love to grapple with an example here for you and get a sense of like how you think this falls, or maybe again, it's subjective and everybody has their own XY axis and their degree of tolerance here. But so a few months ago, I was presenting like an AI essentials training for a group of school counselors. And counselors had the opportunity to explore AI and they were coming up with different and contextualizing different use cases based on things that were helpful for their work. And a few counselors, as you can imagine, were interested in exploring the potential on letters of recommendation. One counselor had used it to develop a letter of recommendation she thought was like really good. And I asked her, how do you like, what's coming up for you as you do this? And she actually said it was like she felt shame. She felt like she was cheating and that it didn't feel right that she was able to use a tool to just instantly come up with a letter that she actually perceived as pretty good that was developing. And I'm wondering, based on her reaction there, if you think that that might be an example of something that falls into quadrant four, or is that like an initial reaction that maybe all of us are going to have to adjust to, or initially it's bringing up strong feelings for us, or maybe like how are you making sense of the example that I brought up for you?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I think so many people are using AI to write letters or essays and so what it really makes me think is I wonder the utility of a letter of recommendation moving forward. Like how do you know that you're actually getting that person's authentic assessment and opinion? In some ways, I remember having a stock letter that I wrote when I used to do tons and tons of letters of recommendation. I had my own stock letter that I would cut and paste to personalize. It's not that different in many ways. And so it sounds like shame was real for her because she wanted to be an authentic champion for the person that she relied on this tool for. I think other people are going to say this is great. And then I wouldn't be surprised if everybody starts to that whole entire letter of rec system starts to become moot because you no longer know if you're actually getting something that's authentic versus generated.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if that entire function goes away in the future. I don't know. It's an interesting, one of the Sherry Turkle, again, I mentioned her because she's just had such an outsized influence on my own thinking. She's been working on this relationship with bots and technology and humans' desire to attach to technology since the Tamagotchis. She's like the
Mhm.
original thought leader
Yeah.
on this for many now decades. But she just recently gave a talk, and in this podcast, she talked about a woman who she does ethnographic, she does deep ethnographic research where she interviews people who are in relationship right now with replica or other aspects of AI. And in this, she talked about how a woman was using AI to write love letters and in that example, for her, the woman felt like this is bringing me so much closer to the person I want to communicate with. I'm using AI to say the things I cannot figure out how to say myself. So for the user, she saw that as a very powerful, positive advancement in her relationship. From Sherry Turkle's perspective, she worries that it means that this woman is now outsourcing that contemplative process of meditating on the person you want to think about your feelings about and then communicate. And so I don't know who's right in that situation, but it is to say this is surfacing tensions and questions about how to feel about this. in a way that is unlike anything we've had to grapple with before. Or maybe not unlike anything, but more extreme. It's like anything that we've had to to experience where this has been similar in the past, it's taking that and putting it on steroids. And now the
Yeah.
question, how do you feel in this new state?
No, that resonates. I think that's what I've read your article now twice, but I think what is coming up for me this time and is exactly that. There is almost like a degree of tolerance aspect to these quadrants where depending on how a different person is like perceiving that, their ability to go further into quadrant 2 might be different from somebody else's and to go into quadrant 3, right? And it seems like there's going to potentially be an element of that. I think the example you just provided is an example of that where somebody what she perceived as acceptable, where she might self assess herself in terms of those 2 quadrants versus where the researcher would look different. I also think what would be interesting in that equation is to determine like what the receiver might have said, what her husband might have said based on that if he had known, or maybe he did know that his wife had been using AI to communicate effectively there. But I also think that that reaction potentially being an interesting one as well, not just like the intention, but also the impact, how it's landing.
Well, that's right, because there's 2 dimensions that you're sort of teasing out. There's how the product is actually designed, like, is it designed with addictive intelligence as its intention? And whether the answer is yes or no, there's still how does the user experience that technology? Because the same product can have a different impact on 2 different people with different, profiles, different life experiences. So you see that even with social media, for example. For some, as you mentioned earlier, for some young women, social media has been incredibly destructive for self-confidence, self-esteem. But you also talk to young people who have a marginalized identity, who an aspect of their self is not reflected in the community around them, or it's not safe for them to share. And through social media and through other social technologies, they have access to communities of people who represent and reflect and affirm those markers. And it's can be game changing for them. So one of my close friends who I work with on this work often talks about quadrant 2. He says, "The adult male in me who now is married with a kid finds some of these AI bots that are prone to talk in very, sexualized terms to be very off-putting at this stage in life." He said, "But my closeted high school self, this could have been a lifeline for me at a really important moment in time." So again, same tool, same person, different stages of life, or same tool, different people, very different impact. And all of this, I think, is going to make this very complicated to regulate and really important for young people to understand so they can make really informed, good choices within for themselves.
Well, and to that last note, I mean, I think it is very complicated because a lot of these technologies are conflating into something that is highly addictive, right? Like social media as a platform with like AI capabilities on these other pieces. But and to make the puzzle a little bit more complicated, I'm really interested to get your take on this. So deepfakes. I mean, deepfakes, I think from my perspective, are inevitably going to play a role in this quadrant because the a lot of these technology companies who are not only taking the capabilities of generative AI but now compounding it by adding voice features to that. In a lot of cases, trying to add like voices that sound very appealing to that, or our ability now to create like highly engaging images that are realistic, whether folks think they are or not. Objectively, they are. There is a lot of hyper realistic images out there that look very real, and then taking some of these images with like a voice element and the functionality of generative AI to have these like elements of persuasive. I'm wondering for you, like the this layer of deep fakes, what do you think the impact potentially is across some of these quadrants? Or like, what is that bringing up for you just in general, the ability of deep fake to inform that relationship component piece?
Well, what I appreciate about what you're doing is you're also talking about any one of these emerging technologies is powerful in their own right, but more interesting and more importantly, when they start to get combined, that's when we start to see the real shifts start to take up. And then to your point about synthetic media, you can combine all of these different tools now to create replications of anybody or content that seems very real. And then because when you marry that with social media, all of a sudden it can reach a scale and volume of an audience that is pretty unprecedented. So again, these things, if it was just synthetic media without the ability to scale it,
Yeah, without
it's
the
on the
distribution,
whole
it may not be as scary, but
right. So these things in combination, I just think are really important to pay attention to. The one thing I will say that scares me the most right now, to be honest, for young people as it relates to these deep fakes is the arrival of the nudification apps. And that is now starting to hit a number of our middle schools and high schools. And I think will become increasingly more and more the norm. I think it's currently pretty underreported. And for those who don't know what that is, it's basically an app that allows somebody to take an image. Most often, it is an image of a girl or a woman, and without consent, undress them. And so, again, and then because of the distribution channels, share it oftentimes widely, again, also without consent. And so the reason why that makes me so nervous is both for the impact that's going to have on young girls and women's mental health. It doesn't even have to happen to you. You just see that it is possible or it happens to a friend or a colleague. And all of a sudden, you're living in that constant state of hypervigilance where you don't know if you can trust other people because you don't know if they're going to do right by your likeness. So, any image, voice recording, you could make me say anything on this podcast. You can literally change all of what I say from here on out that isn't me, and it's going to sound just and look just like me. You have that capability at your fingertips, and it's so easy to do that when that used to be so difficult to try to, and therefore only available to a small number of very, very bad actors. This puts it in the hands of just about anybody who wants to play. And sometimes it's fun and it's funny. And because we don't have social norms around this stuff, you can go from playful to dangerous very quickly in a matter of seconds and not even realize that you've crossed that threshold. You can imagine again, like the young high school boy who is curious about the young woman he's got a crush on, and in his imagination, historically, he might be undressing her, which is, by the way, a perfectly developmentally appropriate thing to do in your imagination. But now there's a tool that can make that happen, and then the stakes for that young woman are quite considerable. And so, again, the lines you can cross the lines very quickly, and that's what's new about this. And that's why I think it's so scary because we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to think about it. We don't know how to be in relationship to each other about it. And it can happen and change so quickly.
So, I mean, that resonates so much. It is something that I've noticed as well, and I'm absolutely terrified by. As an example, I mean, some of the things that I've just done on my own end since starting this learning journey is I had a son a year ago. I have not posted one picture anywhere online of him. It's a decision that my wife and my family have made because of the fact that, as you've described, now in 2024, really in 2023, your images, your voice, right? Video capabilities, all of those things can be used to be trained on and increasingly well. And in certain instances by bad actors, or sometimes even to your point, unintentionally, bad mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, can
Yeah.
still be used to like weaponize against you in that way. And I think like with that in mind, I'm curious, like what other I wasn't intending to go here so quick, but it feels important just with the flow of the conversation. Like, what other advice might we be able to offer like individuals or schools with like the proliferate? I think we just shared a lot of like some scary, but some also very exciting things of how AI might be able to impact relationships. And I'm wondering, like at this point today, with what we do know, without having the benefit of a 10-year sample size to really understand how this is unfolding, like maybe what advice can we offer for what schools or individuals should be prioritizing or precautioning against here?
I think at the end of the day, the thing I most care about is that we bring this into a conversation into the forefront and in a multi-generational way. So historically, when there's something that has the potential to be dangerous, we tell young people we come with sort of absolutisms like you can't have a cell phone ever until you're 16, which by the way, I believe in delays, but again, that poses a conundrum for a lot of young people. Or we say abstinence is the only path forward, or we come with strong black or white assertions. And I think for young people, particularly when this is obviously, I have four quadrants because it is inherently complex. What we want to try to do is to be able to explore those complexities and learn and and tinker and try and discuss and debate out in the open in a world where we can get the benefits of perspectives we may not have from our own small vantage point. We're able to come to some of these more nuanced needs and nuanced solutions that are oftentimes not as easy to see or implement, but we actually really double down on good judgment. We take the time to explore the values behind the assertions that are being made and ask young people, what do you think about this and why? And why does that matter? And if you play that out this way and you play it out this way, what do you see as the possible futures and which one do you want and why? And I just think this is one of those moments where it's changing so quickly and there isn't a silver bullet solution. So the best thing we can do is double down on the discourse and make sure that it isn't just something that happens behind a closed door in a kid bedroom alone, left for them to explore and make meaning on their own, but instead something that we can all explore, talk about, make meaning in, and choose better choices together regularly over and over and over again.
Yeah, that resonates so much. I think too, from my perspective in hearing your potential advice is in many ways it solves a couple of problems that we have, I think, in education currently. I think one of the problems we or challenges I think we currently have is that a lot of folks are curious about how we can support our young people with AI tools, given the fact that a lot of these tools you have to be 13 and older to use. So, like, how do we prepare our eighth graders and below with some of these types of tools? With having, from my perspective, I think conversation around some of these critical topics, such as relationships in a world of AI, as I think we're alluding to here, what AI deepfakes are. Like you can have a conversation without directly interacting and engaging with the tool. I think the second thing I really appreciate about the perspective that you're bringing up is I think across education as a whole, oftentimes, as you have described, like things can really be treated in that absolutism, right? This black and white state. And I think what is really critical that our young people are learning as they navigate and become hopefully productive young adults is that the world is complex. There's a lot of gradients, right? There's a lot of nuance to it, and in many ways, like a high sign of like extreme intelligence is being able to hold like multiple complexing views across things and being able to like sit in those and have conversations. And I think this feels like a really critical topic to have that type of conversation in. It might even be a good launch topic into other topics that as a society we have difficulty holding nuance and complexity and discussing, but is actually a really good set of muscles for our young people to flex is learning how to have conversations, disagree with somebody, have a different perspective, and that's okay. And like, let's sit in that, let's have a conversation and let's explore that, right? Let's not always try to convince or persuade or bulldoze over each other around things. Let's actually have a really productive conversation. And it feels like it would check off both of those boxes for our young people.
That's right. The irony is if we get better at having that kind of discourse and connection in schools and outside of schools regularly, perhaps we'll need the chatbots less anyway, because we'll have
Yeah,
that
that's
hum
true.
human interaction that we desire and that we long for anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates so much. There was one other thing I wanted to, like, really make sure I asked you about, which is maybe, like, a hard pivot from the other pieces, but we've been skirting around it a little bit, and I thought based on I know much of the work that you've been doing, you might have an opinion on, which is so something I've noticed over the past 5 months, potentially it'd been happening sooner than this, but has come onto my radar in the last 5 months, is this proliferation of schools who are jumping into cell phone bans with schools, and maybe actually really related to this idea of absolutism. So it seems like a lot of schools are now starting to ban cell phones in classrooms or when certain there's a spectrum of like banning cell phones during instructional time, banning them altogether in schools, putting them in pouches, like a lot of these initiatives that are happening. This is happening though at the same time that tools like artificial intelligence are on the rise, right? At least across society, albeit maybe not in schools in the same way. So I'm curious from your perspective, like how are you making sense of some of these mixed signals that we're receiving around emerging technologies in schools? Like on the one hand, cell phones are saying this thing, social media says this thing, and now AI is giving us this. Like how are you maybe like grappling with these mixed signals here?
I will say I am still a bit conflicted about how schools should handle this question about technology. I personally am of the mind that because young people do have so much time on social media and then on screens outside of school, in addition to what's happening during the school day, there is a real benefit and relief that can be had from having a mental break, a time where this is the window in which I can just be present with either my learning or my people and know that this is my time oasis. This is the break that I get to have from it. Not because it's bad or wrong in its entirety, but because we want a relationship where we're both in and a relationship when we're out. And so I am open to this idea that cell phone bans during the school day may serve an important function. I really am. I worry that we're doing this though without the conversation and insight from young people. A lot of this is adult decision making. And it's not to say that adults sometimes don't need to make decisions on behalf of young people, particularly given different ages. But it does feel like it's an important conversation for us to be having together versus in opposition. And that matters in large part because there's very few things that are as pronounced and different multi-generationally than technology today. And so I do often just worry that we are missing important nuggets of wisdom and insight when we make decisions absent having young people at the table. But I think I lean towards this idea that having breaks from technology that everybody takes at the same time together is really productive, because if everybody else is off, then you're not having to wonder what are you missing. It allows everybody to be present together. And I think there's some real wisdom in that.
Yeah, to your point, I think I would definitely double down on the students should have a voice at the table. Oftentimes, when it comes to having strong opinions on these things, they do, and
Mhm.
it's usually actually a really good perspective too. Oftentimes, I think the adult in us might feel like, oh, well, they're gonna do what's just in their self interest, or they're gonna say they want cell phones and this. And oftentimes, you'd be surprised. I mean, I think even with the artificial intelligence emergence as an example, I've seen some studies. A recent one that I did a conversation on was with the ACT. They did this large study with a bunch of students who were taking that, high school students. They were asking them their perspectives on using AI across a lot of things. And even as an example, something like a personal statement, the overwhelming consensus from them is that they would feel bad using it on something like a personal statement to do it. So oftentimes I think that skeptical voice in our head of they're only going to do what's in their self-interest, it's
Right.
actually not accurate. Like students are actually just like adults. They're willing to, when you give them an opportunity to step
Yeah,
into like a leadership role and share their voice in a big way, they'll do it. They will do it.
that's right. Well said.
Well, Michelle, I think it's very important that I ask you this question as somebody who's been a lifelong educator to just close out our time together, which is if you could wave your magic wand and improve one aspect of education, what would you do?
Hmm. I think it's in the theme that we just talked about. It would be youth agency. I just think there is so much potential and inspiration and insight and wisdom and power that our young people have. And that drives the kind of curiosity and passion for learning, for our workforce, for human connection. And instead, so much of our average school is compliance oriented. We ask kids to sit at their desks, isolated, looking forward, passively listening, and studying sequentially what an adult has sequenced for them to learn in a certain order and in a certain way with a certain set of methods. And I just think if we could flip that to really center youth agency and what they learn, how they learn it, with whom they learn it, I just think we would see so much more engagement and aliveness and curiosity and human goodness coming from our students if we really just changed that set of conditions around them.
Well said. Michelle Culver, thank you for your time today.
It's so good to be with you, Daniel. Thank you.